All right, good afternoon. Good to see everyone again. We're back between two Bibles. Episode 31. It's the new year, so happy New Year. Hard to believe.
2022.
Yeah, I know, 2022. Man. Yeah, kind of crazy. I was, you always have your predictions for maybe what the year's going to bring, but I guess we'll just kind of go with the punches.
We're going to finish reading the Bible in
Amen. Very good. We're going to finish reading the Bible this year. It's been kind of fun, and today we're getting through the remaining historical books, if you want to call them that. And we kind of finish out, the epilogue to the Old Testament story. We're like halfway through the Old Testament, because now we're going to cover a lot of the poetic books with the prophets and the wisdom literature.
Yeah, because next week will be Psalms. The week after that we'll be covering Job.
Right.
And then we'll have Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, depending on how you say it.
However you like it.
And then the prophets.
And then the prophets, which we'll have fun with all of them. But today, the last kind of three narrative books here, and what do we got?
This week we have Psalms 91 to 93, Matthew 1 to 4, Colossians 1 through 4, Ezra 1 through 10, and Nehemiah 1 through 4.
Perfect. So, and we thought today, because we did Colossians last week for our read through the Bible, and then today we're picking up with Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. We thought it'd be a good idea just to kind of cover those three books.
They're all the post-exile books.
Yeah.
So they kind of were, Ezra and Nehemiah especially, they were on the same scroll.
Right.
And then Esther's just it kind of takes place during the events of what's going on in Ezra, is how I understood it.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of, kind of background, if we're coming into this, right, as we kind of approach the story, what's kind of the context leading around that you kind of remember if you pull it out there?
Basically, the people rebelled. God finally fulfilled his threat, basically, to send them into exile. They've been in exile for around 70 years.
Yeah.
It's actually promised in Jeremiah, I think, that they'll return to Jerusalem. And so this is basically the fulfillment of that promise made in Jeremiah, which we'll get to when we get to Jeremiah, but that the people would come back to the promised land. They don't come back as their own kingdom. They're still under the rule of the Persians at this time.
Yep.
Yeah,
Cyrus.
it's whatever, because it changes depending on what time in history you're in.
The powers that be, they're changing hands.
Yeah, because they actually got exiled by Babylon.
Yep.
And then they get returned under the Persians because the Persians defeated the Babylons.
Yep.
Is that how that works?
Yep.
So basically the Babylonian king got judged by God by the Persians, and now the Persians are letting the people go back to the promised land and rebuild the temple, and then eventually rebuild Jerusalem's walls.
Yep. And there you go. That's kind of the historical back. And there's a lot, and I think it opens up with that proclamation of Cyrus, and we'll get to Cyrus here in a second, because there's actually some of the I'm blanking out on his name. I want to maybe say it's Isaiah. Isaiah actually names Cyrus by name, saying he's the one that's going to let them come back home. He's going to be God's anointed. That's
why people think Isaiah must have been written much later than people know was written, because
they don't believe in prophecies.
They don't think he could have been right on that.
Right. So here we, the kind of the context coming up, hands are changing quickly, right? There's the Assyrian Empire, and they were the big bad guys. They're the ones that, would take names, all that, and they're the ones that destroyed the northern kingdom. And then after that, the Assyrians get destroyed by Babylon, and then Babylon comes in and takes away the southern kingdom, so they're in exile. And then the Babylonians find themselves outdone by the Persians.
Which we get some of this in Daniel, too, don't we? Because Daniel takes place during essentially the exile up till them coming back in Ezra and Nehemiah too.
Right. And I do believe he does get into the Persian period. Daniel does a little bit there too, before he gets off into like his prophecies.
Because there's some of that with the different kingdoms in Daniel too.
Right.
There, so.
Yep.
Anyway.
And this is with the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they would take people away, and they didn't do this just to like the people that we know in the Old Testament. They did to everyone. Like, they came in, they conquered, they destroyed their gods, in a way of saying ours are more powerful, and then they took the people and just would scatter them.
Because they leave some remnant. That's
poor.
how we get the Samaritans in the New Testament, is that's the remnant left of the northern kingdom.
Yeah.
That then mixed with the people who got resettled there.
Yep.
So, they just couldn't I suppose then the people couldn't rise up and fight back.
It's how you deal with rebellion. So what you do is you take the important people, the smart, the educated, the powerful, the influencers, and you take them and you just scatter them everywhere. There's no chance for them to unite or band together. Mm-hmm. And when they go to their random town, there's other people that have also been exiled there. So it's just a bunch of exiles living everywhere. And that's kind of how the conquerors wanted it. Like, our feet are on your head now, and that's just how life is. The Babylonians would one-up this. They did it actually a little smarter, and they would take the wealthy and the educated and say, we're going to have you be in our government now because we want the best and the brightest to be serving our country,
and that's what happened to Daniel.
Yep. So
which we'll get to when we get to Daniel, and
history friends. And but the Persians, when they conquered the Babylonians, they were very sensitive to the fact that they didn't want to upset any of the gods of the people. And so we actually have court records that we have from Cyrus telling other people to go home and build again your temples, build again your cities, and pray. So when we see this proclamation by Cyrus here, it's actually can be attested to by historical fact that Cyrus did do this, and he wanted everyone to go home back to his nation and build back his temple and pray to God. So that way Cyrus is kind of doing his checking list, like, okay, making sure I don't offend any of the gods, and well, it's kind of like
I suppose you send the people home and say, pray to your God for me, too.
Which is kind of what he tells them to do, too. And he even sends them off with the goods, kind of like almost when Exodus, they left with gold and all this stuff. Yeah. Cyrus lets them kind of go home and says, here's like stuff to go with you. And so Cyrus is seen as kind of this, redeemer of the Israelites, of the people of God. And he tells them to go home and rebuild their temples, rebuild the walls, rebuild the cities.
So Ezra and Nehemiah almost kind of a repeat of the Exodus then.
In a way, yeah.
We've talked before about how the story in the Old Testament keeps kind of cycling around, and so we kind of cycled back around to the Exodus and entering the Promised Land again.
Yeah. And the chance to go, and this is kind of, where Chronicles leaves off, but a lot of the books of the Bible kind of end towards the end of it, where they're kind of the hope that God will reassemble his people again. And we see a fulfillment of that where God, precursor of what ultimately happens in Jesus. But here in Ezra and Nehemiah, we especially will see that God's people get to come home, that the 70 years of exile are up, and we find out what they're up to. So kind of with that in mind, let's just probably dig in, I suppose. But you get to Ezra, and Ezra's a priest, and he's kind of leading these families. There's kind of two sections to the book of Ezra. There's chapters 1 through 5, and then there's chapters 6 through 10. And
because there's almost like 60 years between the first group coming and then Ezra coming.
Yep. So this is kind of detailing the first return. So there's a couple returns. There's a couple trips back. So it's not like everyone at once is like, all right, let's go. It's kind of like wave 1 and wave 2, and some are coming back to settle the land again. But it begins with this historical proclamation, which we've actually already seen in the Book of Chronicles.
Yep, and Ezra starts the same way Chronicles ends.
Which maybe means that Ezra is the one who wrote, Chronicles too.
I know there's some debate about who wrote. It seems like people seem to think Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah were all compiled by the same person.
Right.
Because, Chronicles, of course, is a compilation of a bunch of different records. Obviously, keep saying, if you want to know more, refer back to this record, and so presumably those are the records that were used to compile it. I know some people don't think Ezra and Nehemiah were written by Ezra or Nehemiah, but that it drew from their personal writing, because some of this is in the first person, some of it's in the third person. Because the first person actually makes it really unusual for the Old Testament, because I think they're the only books that do have first person. Even the prophets don't talk in first person.
Yeah. So it is they are unique in that sense. They have not a different spirit, but they have a different kind of almost mindset going into this, where you have your books like Deuteronomy and Joshua and Kings. They kind of have like the same kind of almost narrative story going on in the background, and this just kind of has a different kind of pull. And you'll see that too with the prophets. You have the pre-exilic prophets, so like Amos and Obadiah and Micah, and they have they're all poetic. And then the last three, the post-exilic prophets, so Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, are actually they're in prose. So there's like a difference. There's a culture has changed for them. Their literature has changed a little bit.
It feels to me, especially reading it's almost more like these are the people talking to God. They're written to talk to God, whereas the rest of the books all seem to be more of God talking to the people.
Almost less mythic in a sense.
Yeah, which, based on where they are, the prophets are done. I mean, there's three prophets mentioned in here, and then after that,
they're just kind of it's kind of like
there's
the
nothing.
age is coming to a close.
Yeah,
and God is done speaking. Everything that's happened in Exodus, the story that's being told there, the story that's played out, it kind of comes to an end here. And this is, like we said, kind of the epilogue. It's kind of the after effects here. It's the afterbirth, maybe you want to say.
It's kind of like leaving people with a little bit of hope.
Right.
It's like the post-credit scenes in a Marvel movie.
It kind of is. Yeah, these are kind of the post-credit scenes. Here's what you need to know before we hit to the New Testament. And these are records. These are a lot, like you said, talking to God, where we don't really have God's interaction a lot in this. No. It's almost more drawn back. And we notice that in these books with Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, a lot of them are kind of hoping, okay, God, you said all this was going to happen. It's now happened, and I guess now we're waiting on what you're going to do next. Because that's where they all left, like Jeremiah the prophet. Moses had said this, that you're going to be taken into exile, and then in exile you're going to remember God, and he's going to bring you back, and then that's where it leaves off. It kind of almost trails off.
They're sort of in a perpetual season of Advent, waiting.
Right. They're kind of left with, okay, what's God going to do next? So here's all these promises. It's almost like God's like during this time making promises. He tells David he's going to have a son on the throne. Somehow Abraham, all people are going to be blessed through this family here still. And you're kind of like, okay, how's this all going to culminate? And these books kind of, are waiting for that, waiting to see what God's going to do. But they do fill in some important gaps, and they're inspired scripture. Yeah. So they tell us, of their waiting. And what's some of the waiting that you notice? What are the people looking to do? What do they want to do? What do they do when they come home from exile?
Well, they want to build the temple. That's kind of the first big thing here.
Right.
Because, it lists a lot of the, especially it focuses a lot on the Levites who've returned and who's responsible for what part of the temple.
Yeah.
Rebuilding the altar. They redo some of the major festivals. I think Passover is celebrated here, the the Festival of Booths, some of the other ones. There's another one in here that did they? I don't know.
Yeah, something like that, right?
Anyway.
We'll get.
But the building of the temple is the big thing in Ezra, at least.
Yeah, and you'll see this
return to worshiping God.
Haggai and Zechariah are big on that too. Rebuild the temple, right? Because this is important. Like, you're coming back home, rebuild your homes. Yes, this is good. Do that. Rebuild the walls, but the temple's kind of like their whole identity is based around that, and they want to restart the worship there. And we'll see that here in these chapters. There's a lot of beautiful kind of the climax.
Some of it seems a little bit kind of like how it's explained is almost a little bit like how the building of the first temple is explained a little bit. Is how I was like, oh, it felt like weird echoes back to that.
Yeah, and they kind of want to see themselves as that, right? These Judeans, as they're now called. They see themselves as, okay, we're this family of Abraham. This is now everything that's happened has happened to our family, our history, and we are the continuation of that story. So this is kind of them, playing that out here too. So you should see those echoes.
They haven't had a temple. They haven't had sacrifices for 70 years.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and this is why the book of Ezra really focuses on the priest and the families and the genealogies. Yeah. We see that in here, and it's just like, oh, okay, why is this in here? Because this is important for them, it gives them credibility, and it allows them to kind of recontinue and say, yep, this is who we are. We can restart this stuff. One of the things I was noticing here in chapter 1, back in there, in verse 5, then rose up the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred up to go rebuild the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem. So it's kind of, we see this as a movement from God. So this is not like a human movement. It's not like a sociological movement or something like that. God is at work here to stir these people and tell them to go home. And then with them, of course, they take everything that was in the temple. So Nebuchadnezzar took away. Cyrus says, here's that, and take it back with you. So they go back. So then they arise, they go back home. We do have kind of at least the first one here. We have the family of the kings of Judah. So David's family line, Zerubbabel. He's one of the people that leads people back.
Because this temple, the temple that's rebuilt, called Zerubbabel's temple?
Yeah, typically.
Because this temple actually isn't the temple that Jesus
wanted
either.
No.
Because this one gets not exactly destroyed. Doesn't it kind of keep getting rebuilt, and then Herod raises it and rebuilds it, kind of thing?
Essentially. Yeah.
Instead of fixing it up, he just rebuilds it.
And I think because this is the second temple, but Herod's is called the third temple because he kind of looked at that and says, "Oh, we can do better."
Yeah, because this one's even simpler than the first one.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Oh yeah, this is like bare bones. Like this is kind of like.
I know it says something about later the people who had seen the first one wept.
Yeah.
And I always wonder if it's because
Yeah.
they remember the first one and they're mourning what was lost.
And the prophets too, they talk about that this house will be greater than the former house. Even though right now it looks like it's just 4 walls and a roof. That's pretty much what the new temple looks like. So it's just, the bare bones is what they have to do now. It's not as ornate. It's not as pretty. But God promises them in those prophets saying, this house is going to be even greater because I'm going to be there. That's what's going to make this temple great, which is ultimately then fulfilled in Jesus and his church, which is the greater temple. So we see here we get chapter 2 lists out all the family names who are coming back, how many are coming back all together. And I think, where's the total here? The whole assembly together is 42,360. So that, first coming back there is not a terribly ton amount of people. Especially when you look back at the, hundreds of thousands of the people of Judah and the people that went to war, the 2 million that went out during the exile and more. Here we just have a very small remnant. And that's exactly what the prophet said was going to happen. A small remnant is going to return. It's not as glorious or as beautiful as it used to be, as many, but it's a small, faithful remnant that's coming back. We have the priests then are also listed, and the various servants and the goods and all of that, the materials that they have, it's all listed out here too in chapter 2. And then in chapter 3 is when we get to the actual rebuilding of the temple proper here. And what do you notice about that when they first lay the foundation and start building the temple? What's something that kind of sticks out?
I thought it interesting that they rebuilt the altar before the temple.
Yeah.
So they were able to start offering sacrifices because it took them forever to rebuild this temple too.
Yeah.
They stalled a few times.
And that's kind of an important thing too when we remember all temples have altars don't need a temple, but all temples need an altar.
Yeah.
And the altar is kind of like the most important thing in the altar is the most important thing in the temple. It's the place where everything happens. We see, you see the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're building altars everywhere and then naming it after something that God had done or said, and then offering sacrifice. You see that with Noah. So altars are very important. They're the kind of the communication spot between God and his people where the action happens.
We still get that in our church. I mean, we have the altar, and that's where either you're facing the altar or standing on the other side facing us. So that's where we set communion. It's where, we'll be doing for Life Sunday where we're going to lay carnations on it.
Yeah.
It's kind of is the center of our...
Yep.
We don't slaughter animals on it anymore, but...
In fact, this is why we have the one sacrifice given to all is on the altar with communion, right? Because you lay that upon the altar. That's where the sacrifice that's given to us. And then, of course, like in art, you have the linen sheet that's over. That's the linen shroud over Jesus. So it's kind of like the body, but of course the body it's not being given to us. The living body of Christ, and that's why it has usually little 5 crosses on the linen shroud, right, to mark the 5 wounds of Jesus.
Yeah, we have 5 crosses on our altar, 2 carved into the top, and actually the front too. There's 5 crosses, and
that's kind of the whole purpose behind it.
That's why it's weird when churches don't have an altar when they get rid of the altar.
It's because, that tells you don't believe in the bodily presence of Jesus Christ and the sacrifice given for all. That the theology will play out in your building and your structure and your thinking. At least it tells you that it's absent in our thoughts. When we should remember. So they rebuild the altar and then they start sacrifices on it. And it's kind of a big celebration. Like the moment that they begin able to offer sacrifices, it's kind of like a momentous occasion. There's sacrificing, there's the singing that breaks out. So it's kind of a day to be remembered. And they start rebuilding the temple here. And we forgot to mention the time period here, but this is about 538 BC when Cyrus tells them to go home. Scholars, you kind of start wondering, okay, when is the 70 years exactly? Because they left in 587 was when it was all destroyed, and then it's rebuilt in 530 something, 516. And so when is the exact 70 years? Some people try to put that together.
Because there's actually kind of to exile, or to
Right.
where they're brought into exile.
Yeah,
to,
some are deported in 605 BC. Is when
yeah.
I think Daniel's deported around that time. Yeah, I know Ezekiel is. Yeah.
Anyway.
We'll get to those books here too. But yeah, there's
Maybe it's
three,
not literally 70 years either.
and
70 kind of, it's a 7.
usually how it's calculated is the destruction of the temple to the rebuilding of the temple
Okay.
when it's finished. That's actually about the 70 years. So even though there's maybe some who were taken out of the land earlier and some who come back later, they calculate by the time when the temple's destroyed in the 80s and then when it was rebuilt in the teens.
Because I suppose the temple being destroyed was kind of their exile. I mean,
it was the final kind of
God
sever.
is no longer present kind of thing.
Yeah, when you can't offer sacrifices, there's no faith. There's no faith that you can hold on to now. It's being scattered. It's the communion. There you go. The fellowship is gone. So they rebuild the temple. Chapter 3. They sing the song. I love it. When the builders laid the foundation. This is chapter 3, verse 10. The builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord. The priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and Levites and the sons of Asaph with cymbals to praise the Lord, according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his steadfast love endures forever. One, they're quoting the Psalms, which David wrote. But I love that kind of, this is what David had prescribed. So they're not creating something new. They're saying we have this back again, and it's returned. Big kind of a huge moment. It's a coming home reunion kind of thing that's happening here. All the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But as you noted, many of the priests and Levites and heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted with joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away. So you can imagine this, the tens of thousands of people who are gathered there. It makes a very light. Have you ever been Lambeau Field, or for me, the big house when you go to watch Michigan or something like that, right? It's deafening. You almost can't hear your own voice with the whole crowd there. And here that's happening too. And you can't distinguish between laughing and the weeping. That's kind of a beautiful description of worship, how it looks, right? You can't tell who's laughing and who's weeping. It's just all blends together. So that's kind of cool. Well, unfortunately, they're building the temple. It all sounds great, right? There's no resistance, and then that comes to an end.
Yeah. Then the next several chapters are them getting opposed, writing letters back and forth between different leaders.
Well, lots of letter writing. I guess what's the big deal? Why is there opposition to the temple being built?
Isn't it basically that they think that the people are going to rebel and turn themselves into their own nation again?
Let's see. Adversaries heard that the returned exiles were building the temple of the Lord. They approached Zerubbabel and say, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." These are the Samaritans. So the Samaritans say, "Hey, we're like buddies, and how about we build this house together and we can worship together?" And the Jews are like, "We're not doing that." And so, in fact, they literally said, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, king of Persia, has commanded us." And so, therefore, the Samaritans kind of get upset. This starts the blood feuding here. This is why they hate each other in the New Testament. And so, this causes them to go to the king and say, "Hey, these Jews who are in the land, they're starting to rebuild their walls and their city and, their temple. And if you look in your records, you're going to find that these people are rebellious, that they don't listen to foreign kings, and they're a problem." And this causes that initially the first king to write this is Ahasuerus. He looks at this accusation. He's like, "Oh yeah, you're right. They are trouble. Tell them to stop." And so there's kind of the orders to cease working, and it's kind of tragic and sad. And this continues then until the second year of of Darius, the king of Persia. So this continues on for many years, about 16 years. They have to wait again. And then finally in chapter 5, we get the prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. They make an appearance here. And they come to say, "Guys, it's time to rebuild. Don't worry about the adversaries. God's going to grant us success in this task. And do it. So these two prophets come here to encourage. We're kind of used to the prophets to come here and give like a warning, like better not. Which they do. Like if you don't do this, there's going to be warning. But they say if you do this, you're going to find peace and blessing, and it's going to be okay. And we'll talk more about this when we get to those prophets too. This is actually the first time in the Old Testament when the people actually listen to the voice of the prophets.
That's true.
Because Haggai and Zechariah are like, you should do this. And like I think it's like Haggai was like, and the people listened to the words of Haggai and Zechariah and are like, oh, this is the first time they've done this. And so you can see the change of heart that they now have.
Well, that is kind of a big theme in Ezra and Nehemiah is that they keep, the people are like, oh, what caused us to go into exile? Well, not worshiping God right. So maybe we should worship God right,
Yeah.
kind of thinking, and at least it lasts for a while.
It does, yeah. And this causes them to be really considerate. They want to make sure they're following the covenant again. They know they've broken it, and their kind of hope is that God will reestablish it. And they've heard from the prophets like Jeremiah that God's going to make a new covenant. So they're like, what's that going to be? But yeah, here they're very concerned about this. They do continue, like you said, they write letters back and forth. And they come to the decree, okay, let's rebuild. So Darius issues a decree and says, get back to work. So they successfully argue their case for rebuilding the temple and getting back to work on it. And King Darius tells them, do it. And you have my authority and permission to do it. And don't let anyone stop you. Make sure it gets done, because this is what Cyrus said to do. And we should make sure that his proclamation gets fulfilled. And you have that a lot. You got the law of the Medes and the Persians here.
Yeah. We'll get to that little when we get to Esther here, but yeah, the way they do laws is a little weird to me.
Yeah,
but
it's very specific. Yeah, it's kind of you can't go above the law, not even the king.
I'm gonna say that's the part that's weird to me. But anyway.
So they do finish the temple there in chapter 6, and then it's kind of the big thing that happens is in chapter 6 verse 19.
Passover.
They celebrate the Passover. On the 14th day of the first month.
Don't celebrate the Passover very often, actually. We talk about it as this big feast, but they don't actually do it very often.
And they neglected it. And, it's, especially we see that in the book of 2 Kings 2, that this is the first, there was no Passover like this, that had ever happened in Israel. You're like, oh man, it tells you how far they had fallen. They don't celebrate it'd be like we didn't celebrate Easter here anymore. Like, we stopped celebrating the resurrection, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. If Holy Week was just something like, oh, yeah, I guess that's this week, huh?
Yeah.
Maybe we should do something. It's
like, no, you look forward to it.
Yeah, it's kind of the big deal. Everything circles around it.
Anyway, then Ezra comes along.
Finally, yeah, so they celebrate Passover. It's all good. And then Ezra is sent. So the guy the book is named after, he comes into the story here. And this is where we do get the change in like the tone into the letter of this book here. It turns from a they to an I, the first person, because this is him. He's witnessing these events now.
Which still means Ezra could have written this whole thing. It could be like Acts with Luke, where it switches all of a sudden to the first person when he shows up in the narrative. Right,
and so we have a jump in time. So this is 516 is when the temple is completed, if I remember correctly.
Sounds about right.
Here is 457, so we're jumping another 70 years almost into the future. And Ezra is now sent, and of course, what's his task?
He's supposed to teach the people, isn't he?
Yep. He's here to kind of instruct them in the ways of the Lord.
Because isn't he the one who reads is it him or Nehemiah who sits down and reads the whole law?
Ezra does.
But that's in Nehemiah,
in the book of Nehemiah, yeah.
That's why
we'll get there.
Like, wait.
So he goes up to kind of continue the work here to actually, I think it's called to kind of reinforce the exiles, the returned exiles. So they go up. He subscribes because he's well learned. He knows this. Like, it's almost like Ezra's like, I've been waiting for this my whole life. Like, he's been training for this. He's been studying, and he's gonna kind of rekindle this whole thing. So he goes back to fulfill the work that he's been given to do. And he gets back, and he has some task at hand. So the rest of the book of Ezra here, chapter 8. There's a genealogy with those who returned with Ezra, so he had a group come with him too, and I think there's not that many. It's only a few hundred, I know that. Yeah, a couple thousand looks like. So it's not too many go back with him, but they do. And he sends for the Levites. He's asking for protection, because isn't it him that goes back and we don't need to we don't need to have people guarding us to go back.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so.
And I love with Ezra because he's on his way back and he's in kind of a rush. And he's like, we don't need the protection. We'll just go and make it there. Which is kind of crazy. You know, we're used to like traveling across the country and not really being worried about being robbed or killed or stuff like that. But this is a very frequent occurrence in the ancient world.
Well, there's a lot of turmoil.
Yeah. Highway bandits, you know, travel by night. So Ezra leaves without guards or protection. It's just kind of like, hey, God's going to protect us and keep us safe until we get to Jerusalem. And God does. And so they rejoice in that. They kind of like worship God. Like, we made it without a problem. And so that's kind of awesome. So we fasted and implored our God, and he listened to our entreaty. So you kind of get this kind of, this is man talking to God. It's not really from God's perspective. This is from Ezra's perspective, which is unique in the Old Testament especially. So they arrive, and then Ezra encounters a problem when he gets there. What's kind of the problem when he arrives?
Talk about the marriage thing.
Yeah, isn't that something?
Several of the people have been intermarrying with the other people groups around them, which is what got the people into trouble in the first place. I mean, you think back to like Solomon marrying all of his foreign wives; they led him astray.
Right.
So it's not even like these people. It's not like Rahab or Ruth who are brought into the people of God. It's these, you know, their wives and their children aren't being taught the Jewish way.
Yeah. And if we remember the promise in the Old Testament, it was through the family of Abraham that God would send a blessing to all the world. So Ezra, he sees the threat here for him is like, okay, this promised seed is going to be muddied. It's going to go away because we're going to lose our heritage that God has given to us. So he sees a big problem. And this chapter 9 is a huge prayer that Ezra prays to God. You know, he's ashamed. He's sitting here like, you know, he kind of retells the story a little bit there as well. You know, you brought us out of slavery. We have now sinned against you again. We're in the land, but now we're forsaking your covenant all over again. And he's really upset by this. And
because there's also the threat of there'd be no remnant. Chapter 9, verse 14. Shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the people who practice these abominations? Would you not be angry with us? Would you not be angry with us until you consumed us, so that there should be no remnant nor any to escape?
Yeah.
Because I mean that's the thing. They're small remnant. They're thankful to be back, and this is threatening. I mean, again, this is kind of why they went into exile in the first place. They went after foreign gods because they,
And they're worried. Yeah, so they're rightly worried about this. And behold, we are before you in our guilt, for none can stand before you because of this. Ezra he really knows his books of Moses. He knows probably the prophets pretty well too that are written down. He might have been part of the reason why we have a compilation of the prophets. He's kind of concerned with what he sees among the people and the sins that are before them. He's like, great, here we go all over again. We're just going to repeat the whole cycle of us being unfaithful to this. Well, amazing enough, Ezra prays, he makes confession, and we're told in chapter 10, verse 1, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel, for the people wept bitterly. They all confess their sins. They say, yeah, we have done this. The big kind of question at the end of the book here is what's kind of maybe a scandal that's laid out because of this chapter.
These guys basically divorced their wives.
Yeah.
So people kind of wonder about that.
They do. Once again, this is old covenant stuff. They're worried about the future promised seed, right? So now that Jesus has come, there's no concern for this. We'll get taught, with like yoking yourself with unbelievers.
Yeah, you shouldn't willingly, knowingly marry someone who believes differently than you.
Right.
But you shouldn't divorce someone because they believe differently than you.
Right. Yeah, and you had those early Christians, right, who maybe the wife or the husband would convert, but the spouse wouldn't. And Paul, he's dealing with what do you do with that marriage then when the wife is a believer and the husband's not? Do you divorce? Do you stay together? And Paul's sitting there like, if he's willing to deal with you being a Christian, then stay married. If he's like, I'm not going to be put into this kind of shame. Get out of here. Paul will say it's okay.
We no longer have to worry about the promised seed coming.
Right.
Whereas this is the big deal with marriage and the Israelite people remaining pure and children and all that in the Old Testament is that the promise is going to come through a child.
Yeah.
From the Israelites. So you have to keep that in mind.
Yep. So it's one of those things, we have a description of it here in the Old Testament. We can see the reason why they do it and did this here, but it's not like we can use this as justification for us to say, all right, we're going to do this too.
It's one of those things where you're sinning if you do, you're sinning if you don't kind of thing, because you sinned in the first place and put yourself in this position.
Yeah. And that promised seed is exactly how the book of Ezra ends with, and some of the women had even born children. So it's kind of like, what are we going to do with this mess? Yeah, it's kind of, this is a big problem. And that's where the book of Ezra ends. You know, it kind of leaves off there. And then Nehemiah kind of picks up here.
When does Nehemiah take place in terms? Because Ezra shows up
445 BC. So
this is like with the second return, like with when Ezra returned kind of thing?
Ezra came back in 457, and this is probably like 12 years later.
Okay.
After Ezra has come back.
So basically Nehemiah wants to go return and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem.
There you go.
The wall of Jerusalem.
The wall of Jerusalem. We have
I should put holes in it.
Lego walls. They're going home to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem here. And this is, so he comes back to do a building project. So Ezra is about rebuilding the temple. Nehemiah, he's coming back to build the walls. And
because Jerusalem's also important within the prophets and stuff, because kind of Jerusalem is meant to be like the city, basically, which we know that's where Jesus is ultimately crucified. So and to have protects the temple.
Yeah, and we remember when the Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came, they destroyed the walls, they tore them all down, and so there's huge gaps in the walls. Like there may be a section here, but then there's a huge hole here, and then it picks up again. And this is kind of bad.
In the ancient world, things were a lot more dangerous and violent. The wall around a city is what kept the people inside the city safe. Because you'd have a wall around the city, and you have a gate that would go in and out, and who came in and out, who was in the city, who was out of the city. With holes in the wall, people are just coming in left and right, and there's no security. Like you said, bandits can come in and out, foreign armies just can come in. Yeah. So when you have a wall up around your city in the ancient world, you're protected, you're secure. And this is why, like a lot of the Psalms will talk about God's protection, the fortress of the fortress of Zion, and that's all listed out there as well. But Nehemiah, he hears about the destruction of the city, how the walls are still kind of in bad shape, and he cries, and he's a cupbearer for the king. And so the king, Artaxerxes here, he's like, Nehemiah, what's wrong? And they must be pretty close, because Nehemiah, he feels comfortable laying out, because you wouldn't do that with a king. You wouldn't tell him what's bothering you like that, especially when you're on duty. It's kind of like, keep up a good look here. He's probably of the level of like, not Moses, who am I thinking of? Joshua.
Yeah. You think like, yeah.
Joshua with where he rose through the ranks and had
Joseph?
Joseph! Oh my goodness. I'm like, that Joshua does not sound right.
So
Joseph.
And we have the cupbearer, right, in prison there, and he'd serve the king his drink. He makes sure it's safe and not poison. So Nehemiah has a big task. Yeah. It's an important task to keep the king's drink safe from being poisoned, because everyone wants to kill the king. So he's here, and he hears the request. Artaxerxes is like, what's wrong? He's like, the house of my fathers is in disrepair. The walls are torn down, and I feel like I need to do something about that. And he actually grants the request and says, go, spend some time.
He says, how long do you need, and when will you be back?
And here's some materials on your way. And Nehemiah will actually do 2 trips back. Yeah. And so he goes for a certain time, and he has to come back, and then he comes back again.
Yeah. So there's a lot in here again about working on rebuilding, and then the people oppose, and then there's more rebuilding, and then more opposition.
And it's kind of interesting. It's almost like it's a fight to get back even the bare scraps of what they had, which is a reminder that this is not their land anymore. It belongs to other people. It belongs to foreigners. They're ruled over by foreigners. That they don't even have the right to go back and build what's theirs again anymore.
Because it is once they're exiled, it never is their land again.
They have a glimmer.
Jesus say it's the Romans.
Everyone kind of has a slice of the pie now, and not them though. They just happen to be in the land, but not they're in the land, but not of the land.
Yeah.
Yeah, in that way.
They kind of remain as exiles almost, even though they return.
Yeah, they never lost the exile almost. It's kind of like the land went away and the destruction of the kingdom, and they never got it back. And, this is what the New Testament still thinks that way too, that we're exiles. Peter will address the church in Rome as exiles. And he notes that to them as well.
It's almost like they had to go back to get the promises fulfilled, and then once the promises are fulfilled, then, obviously 70 AD, the temple's destroyed again, and that's the end of it. And that's kind of the end of the Jews in the land, too, again.
Right.
Now we have Israel again today, but that's not quite the same either.
Right. Yeah. With the book of Nehemiah, this is actually a report. I'm reading my end of the year report right now. The book of Acts is a report. Nehemiah is also a report. He is writing to God.
Yeah, because there's several times in here.
Remember me, O Lord my God, for good.
Yeah.
That's how the book ends, too.
Because I think you did that with your annual report a couple of years ago, something similar to that.
I did. Yeah, I was talking to God in my annual report, which is what Nehemiah, that's who he's addressing. He's not talking to us, he's talking to God. So that's why he'll say, I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. You're like, who is he talking to? He's talking to God. He's addressing God. So it's almost like we get to hear Nehemiah's prayers and thoughts here, but he's directing them at God and not towards us. So he's giving an account of everything to God and what Nehemiah did, what he did for the people, and he's kind of hoping with this report that God will see this, what Nehemiah did, and remember him for good. So Nehemiah is, he's trying to get in with God here, get in good with him. And so he's showing his good works, we would say. He wants to say how much he cares for Jerusalem, the people of God, the promises that God has made. He's a donor. He's a donor. He cares about what happens, and it's part of his story too. There's a conspiracy against Nehemiah in the work too, as we kind of mentioned. We do find out that half of the people who work on the walls and half of the people who don't, half of them carry swords to guard, and the other half are building. So you almost get, once again, this Exodus kind of theme where people are working in haste, right? The people, they ate the Passover dressed up and ready to go. And here they're like, half of them are ready to fight and half of them are building. And, it's kind of a dramatic story here. They try to finish the work. You almost feel the urgency that they need to get this done before it's too late.
And they do get it done.
Yeah. And there's huge sections, like Nehemiah will say, this whole section needs to be repaired, and bum, 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 bum. And then end of chapter 6 kind of says how it is all finished. They get the wall done, and they complete the city, which is great news, right? There's security, there's safety again. There's, it's respectable. Jerusalem is a respectable place to live again, and good and all that. There's a list of the exiles who return, and the total gifts and the people that are there, and in the end of chapter 7, there's this beautiful description. And when the 7th month had come, the people of Israel were in their town. So it's kind of like they're resting. They're enjoying the inheritance again, just kind of like they did when the book of Joshua. So Nehemiah sees himself as kind of a smaller Joshua who's giving rest to the people of God. And in chapter 8, it's a beautiful, awesome chapter. Ezra's back in it. And Ezra gets up and they have a huge worship service, everyone in Jerusalem. And Ezra gets up and he reads from pretty much for several hours. He reads the book of the law of God.
So the Torah.
The Torah, yeah. Some people debate, is it the entire 5 books or is it Deuteronomy that he's reading?
You read all morning, though. It'd almost have to be all 5.
It could be, yeah.
Deuteronomy does take a couple hours to read.
And if you're reading it out loud,
explaining it possibly as you go.
Right. So it could be that. And of course they hear it all. And while he's reading, there's the Levites are going around from like group to group and they're explaining it. And they're saying, here's what he's talking about, or because it sounds like they don't know the language. Some of them don't know the language either anymore. They've kind of lost that, so they speak in Aramaic. They don't know Hebrew anymore. So that's a culture shift as well. It's kind of like with our German, right?
Yeah.
We used to speak German here as Lutherans, and
We used
now
to have German
English.
services.
And it'd be like if Pastor Bradkey came back and started preaching German in the pulpit, you'd be like, huh? We need someone to go around and say, okay, here's what he's talking about, here's what he's saying.
Yeah, it was about 70 years, well, it was 40, 50, 60-ish years ago that we stopped doing German services here.
Yeah, so about that time. So that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah.
Nehemiah, he's the governor. Ezra the scribe, the Levites, they taught all the people, and they encouraged them, right? The people are hearing the words of the law, and they're saying, oh, so we're here because we failed. And, they're kind of upset by it. They're like, wow, this is terrible. We've sinned. This is why we're in this mess. And Nehemiah has to kind of go around and say, no, this is a day of celebration because we're back in the land and there's a future ahead of us now. And so they do celebrate. They give them all food. They celebrate the Feast of Booths, which reminds them of being in the wilderness just like their fathers before them. That's why that's kind of picked up there. The people of Israel confess their sins. Chapter 9 is a great summary story. If you kind of want to get the Old Testament in a nutshell and what this all means, Nehemiah chapter 9 is kind of the chapter to read because it tells you what happened, why this happened, and what they're looking forward to next.
This is one of several places where the whole story is rehashed in the Bible. But that's when people start saying that some of this stuff didn't happen, it's like, well, it's repeated multiple times whenever they talk about their history. Yeah. They're repeating this again and again and again and again. So obviously they think it did happen. So
notice this kind of happens too when we get kind of checkpoints. So Moses will do that before we were brought out of Egypt. Joshua will do that and say, the Lord brought us out of Egypt and he gave us this land. And then you kind of have like David who'll say like, oh, we were brought out of Egypt, we were given this land, and now God has made this promise. So it's almost like each generation has to add in their part of the story.
Their chapter of it.
And we have the Nehemiah section here too. There's the people who sign the obligations, the leaders, the villages. You get more of the dedication of the wall. Services at the temple. Nehemiah is focusing in on the return of the worship. Nehemiah lays out all of his reforms that he's making among the people that they should follow.
He has to strain them out a couple of times.
Yep, he does. Because he has to come back. After 445, he comes back in 434. So he comes back 11 years later.
Because people aren't supporting the Levites, they're working on the Sabbath, and he straightens all that out.
He's like, all right, guys.
Somewhat rather directly, actually.
yeah, it is, isn't it? So that's interesting. He speaks very clearly. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. He's a wonderful guy. He sees this because he sees these reforms as being important.
Yeah.
And then
he sees the people slipping back
into apostasy. Yeah. And once again, he's like, great, here we go. So there's this continuous the people. Even though they're coming back and they're returning, there's still they keep backsliding. Yeah. Jinx. So remember me, O Lord my God, for good is how Nehemiah ends there. And then finally, we'll get to here with Esther.
Esther's kind of a weird story.
It is a weird story. What's weird about it?
There's no mention of God.
Okay. So in the entire, I think, 10 chapters here that we have of Esther, not a single reference of God is made. The only religious thing that happens here is fasting. Right? There's no services. There's no praying. There's no singing. There's nothing along those lines of any rites or worship or anything. It is void of it. There's no mention of God, and so a lot of people are always worried about this book because they're like, okay, it's a very secular book, is what they call it.
But God is very present in it.
He is.
I think you said he's present in the coincidences.
Yeah. So while we'd have no mention of God by name, there's no God said this or God did this or the people saying, maybe God did that. There's none of that. But what we do have are a series of very odd and very timely circumstances that happen.
If you know your Old Testament, a lot of it, it's like, oh, there's God. Kind of.
Yeah, so the big thing in the book of Esther, so the main theme is that this takes place in Persia. These are Jews who live in exile still. This takes place in about 580 BC. So this is about 50 years after they're told to go home. And but here's a remnant that's still living in foreign lands, which we'll see that in the New Testament. Jews are living all over still, the diaspora. And here in the capital city of Susa, There's Esther, there's Mordecai, there are several Jews who live there. And we find out some interesting things about their background and their identity too. But we'll get there in a second. But like I said, the weird coincidences here that happen in the book is that there's a plot to kill the Jews. There's a struggle to kind of change the scenario, change the circumstances. And there's a weird occurrence where the king can't sleep at night, so he wakes up and he just so happens to call for the records to be read to him, because what puts a person to bed faster than reading court records? And he finds out in those court records that Mordecai had saved him.
And Mordecai had never been rewarded for it.
Yeah, and so it's just kind of one of those that was really timely. Yeah. And it calls back to Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, who can't sleep, and he wakes up and he has to have someone interpret his dreams for him. Pharaoh in the book of Genesis, when he's disturbed because of the dreams he's having, he can't sleep, and so he calls Joseph to come and interpret. And here the king Xerxes here, he can't sleep, and so he calls for records to be read to him, and he finds out. So it's just one of those things in the Bible, when kings can't sleep, it's kind of a divine intervention moment. And so here this king can't sleep. And it's a turn in the book. And in fact, everything hinges upon that one little verse there where he can't sleep. So he has something read to him, and it changes everyone's fortunes in the book. Literally a flipping over of the table. But in the book of Esther, what are some things that stick out to you? What's kind of the background story? What's the major theme in it?
Well, I always think it's kind of a weird thing, because basically the king isn't happy with his queen for not showing up to his drunken party.
Right.
I know there's some debate as to exactly how he wanted to display her. And then, then basically you have a bachelor-style event, basically, where all these young women are brought to, be paraded before the king.
It's the Bachelor Old Testament edition, right?
Yeah, basically. Where you got the one guy and all these women who are vying for the position of queen, basically, and which is always a little weird, but
so his vanity is kind of what sets the stage for the story here, right? That his wife Vashti didn't want to cooperate with him, so she gets deposed, and he wants a new one. And Esther, who's a Jew, she gets selected. She gets to be the most beautiful. She catches the king's eye. And he brings her to be his queen.
It's not like she had a lot of choice, probably, in this matter. It's the king, and they're,
Yeah. And, of course, we meet another Jew. It's kind of a relative of Esther's, is Mordecai. And I mentioned this as one of the things I caught here, too. Mordecai is a descendant of Saul. So this is a lineage of Saul's family here. So Esther is related to Saul as well in that case. Because we're told he's Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, Saul's father, a Benjaminite. So we kind of get this Old Testament replay here of Saul's family, the surviving descendants.
Mordecai. There's a Mordecai mentioned in either one of the lists in Ezra or Nehemiah, and I wondered if it was the same Mordecai, if later somehow he ended up going back.
Maybe.
But it could be a different, there's multiple of the exact same names, so it's hard to know. But
Mordecai, that's a good question. It makes you wonder if it's the same Mordecai or not.
It's all around the same time, so.
True. Mordecai, he raised Esther and took care of her. He's the one that kind of helps her, presents her to the king. And during this time, too, in chapter 2, Mordecai discovers a plot against the king. The Greek edition of Esther, which has more chapters than this, actually details the plot and how Mordecai finds out about the plot and the characters who try to kill the king. So there's actually more to that story, which is kind of fun. And how Mordecai exposes the plot, which is kind of a fun story too, but that's not in the Hebrew version. And this is also written, I think, partly in Aramaic too, if I remember correctly. I know Daniel is here, so which is also contributes to its weird style. This is written in Aramaic and not in English, not in Hebrew. So Mordecai finds out about the plot, saves the king from assassination, and then nothing happens to him. Yeah. But then we hear about Haman. And who's Haman?
He's one of the officials or something of the king, or what is it he actually is. And
he's a Haggai. He is, let's see.
Advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him, chapter 3.
Yeah.
So basically he's one of the, big head of the, again, going back to Joseph. Yeah, Joseph. Oh my, I'm going to second guess myself every time I say Joseph now. kind of the same sort of idea, or like Daniel, and when we get to Daniel, where he's kind of like elevated. And basically Mordecai doesn't bow down to Haman.
And that makes Haman mad.
Yeah, Haman gets mad, and so Haman basically plots against the Jews.
Let's kill all the Jews.
Yeah, because I'm mad at Haman, so let's kill all of his people.
Yeah.
And the king just goes along with it.
Yeah, the king, which tells you the vanity of Xerxes here. Haman says, yeah, let's kill all the Jews. Here, sign this edict. These are a problem people. We should get rid of them. Yeah. He's like, all right, sounds good. I trust you. And of course, this is a blood feud going on here. Haman is an Agagite here, who was King Agag, who Saul was supposed to kill. And so this is kind of like an old blood feud here. This is like a rematch between King Saul and this Agagite. And here, Mordecai kind of does the story right and kind of redeems King Saul and his family a little bit. Which is kind of fascinating.
So the question I have is, so the king makes this edict that on this day, which is several months later, isn't it?
Yeah, they cast lots for the day.
Yeah. So the Jews know this is coming.
Yeah.
So
what do you do?
Why don't they flee or do something? I mean, do they just have to sit there and wait until someone comes and kills them?
It's a reminder that in the ancient world, there's not really much you can do, especially being scattered people like that. And when the king says something, the king gets what he wants when he signs edicts. And also, it kind of the inability of them, but this is kind of like the law, and there's nowhere for them to run. This is everywhere. What is it?
It is the empire, so
there's nowhere to go.
This is everywhere.
Yeah, so you're trapped, and escape. Travel. While a lot of people travel, also the means to travel would be a lot, and so
would
not a lot poor would be able to go.
Would this include the Jews that are already back in Jerusalem?
Yeah, it would maybe include them too. So throughout the whole empire,
okay,
all these people would have been slaughtered the Jews.
Okay.
So they all start mourning and lamenting, but there's kind of hope because Esther is on the inside. She has the king's ear. Oh yeah, she has the queen. She has the king's ear on this. And so Mordecai, her relative, comes to her and says, we need you to go to Xerxes and we need you to beg on our behalf to change this, to affect something. And don't think just because you are in the king's palace that you will be spared the slaughter. And who knows, maybe God has appointed you for such a time as this, that you're in this position for a reason. So once again, we have another kind of slip here that God has been the one who's been setting this all up, and he's the one that has been directing the course of events here. So he's the one that put Esther into this position, so that rescue would be given to the Jews. And so she does say, "Okay, I will do this."
Because she could get killed for entering the presence of the king uninvited.
Because you just don't go and visit the king. It's not like we have that too. I can't just go up to the White House door and knock on and say, "Hey, I want to talk to the president."
Secret Service.
Yeah, you get snipers on the roof that'll take me down, and the Secret Service will come get me. And so you can't do that. You can't do it with the king either. So for her, this is risky. If she just enters in and he's in a bad mood or he doesn't want to see her, it's a death penalty for her. She's dead.
Luckily, the king likes the queen.
He likes her a lot, and I love it because he holds out his scepter there, and touch her with it and take it. So that's kind of you're forgiven. So he literally forgives her for coming in unannounced. That's the liturgical rite for being forgiven for him. So she goes and she has a banquet. She has a request to make of him. And they go and they eat, and he's like, "So what's your request?" And she's like, "Come again on another time, and I'll tell you my request with food and banquet." So she delays a little bit, which is kind of interesting. We could talk a lot more about feast in this book because every important decision in this book is made over food, which is kind of fun. But so she invites Haman to come along to this feast, and which puffs up Haman's ego. And he's all excited. He sees Mordecai again.
He gets all mad. So and he's like, I'm going to hang Mordecai.
Make the gallows for him.
Yes.
So Haman makes the gallows to hang Mordecai on. And then finally, Haman goes to first there's the king's dream. Here, you can't sleep at night. He has the records read. He finds out about Mordecai not being honored. And so it's a great setup. So the king invites Haman to come in and says, what should I do for the man I wish to honor? And Haman's like, oh, certainly he's thinking about me. He's like, well, you should do this and this and this, thinking that this is what's going to happen to him. He's like, that's a great idea. Go find Mordecai and do that to him. And he's like, he realizes, oh no. His own wife tells him, looks like you're going to have your downfall, because how are you going to hang him when the king wants to honor him now?
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to do it. Which kind of is the beginning of his downfall here. He goes to the feast here, and Esther finally makes her request, and what does she beg?
The king again offers half my kingdom. What is it with kings and offering up to half their kingdom?
Yeah.
That always gets them into trouble.
It does.
But if I vote people, for they have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed and be annihilated. I would be silent. If we'd sold me, okay.
No, you're right there.
Yeah. Basically that, people are going to be annihilated, and so, basically can the king do something about it? And the king can't just
erase the law,
because I don't get that at
He's
this
the king,
time,
he can do it.
That happens in Daniel too, where he's like, if it's sealed with the king's signet or whatever, it can't be reversed, and it's
the
like,
law,
you're the one who
the
made
versions.
the law. But anyway, so instead, he makes it so that the Jews can defend themselves against the people who are going to attack them, which, again, it makes no sense to me. It seems stupid, but...
Right, this is a conflicting law.
But in the meantime, she points out Haman as the one who did it, which...
Right.
Again, I think the king is kind of stupid.
Who did this? Haman did. What? He's furious. I love it because he goes out from his wrath and he's like walking around kind of like stewing about what's happened. And he comes in, it looks like Haman is trying to fall on Queen Esther here. And so he has Haman hung on his own gallows that he had made for Mordecai. So here we have this great reversal of the situation here. And this is ironic. We see this in the Psalms often, where those who have set the trap have sprung it themselves. Those who lay aside, deadly plans for me, it happens to them instead. So God kind of returns the evil to their own head. And we have that happen here with Haman. So this is exactly how divine intervention and his working happens, that the plans kind of fall back on people who make them. We see that with Jesus. His death kind of is undone by the resurrection, and salvation is given instead. And so we have everything undone here. Haman is put to death. Those who are given the authorization to kill the Jews, they're so confused because they have the order that says, kill the Jews on this date. And then the Jews have an order that says, you can defend yourself on this date. And so it's talking about another way of salvation. It's brought out those who hate the Jews publicly. And when they come to attack, they find themselves like, oh no, destroyed themselves. So it's kind of a period of rest. So it's kind of the way God has lured out all the enemies to be destroyed.
And they actually get to do it for 2 days.
Yeah, so 2 whole days the Jews do this. They destroy their enemies. Yeah. You can talk about here the revenge and things like that. Here, this is how salvation's being achieved. We see that Jesus, right? Vengeance has been taken upon him for all of our sins. Esther saves the Jews. It's a great celebration of that, and they inaugurate a new feast, the festival of Purim, we maybe say. It means the day of casting lots. So the day that was originally cast in the lot for the day of the slaughter has now become the day of the celebration when the Jews triumphed. So once again, even that day is redeemed. So at the end of the book, all the situations and the tragedies have been reversed, and everything's been reconciled and peace is restored. We see that too with Jesus Christ, right? All the scenarios are undone.
Yes, that's something that, while on the cross, something that looked terrible, and the end of all things actually turned out to be for their deliverance.
Yeah.
Or for our deliverance.
And so we see that too. So Esther confirms the practices of the celebration and all the provinces.
I was going to ask you about, there's that line about how people feared the Jews and basically became Jews or something.
Yeah.
Where is that? I know where it is in my Bible at home, but I can't find it here. Here it is. End of chapter 8. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews for fear of the Jews had fallen on them.
So here, all these foreigners are wanting to be a Jew now. I'm one of them too. So this is a great evangelism event. Yeah. So here we see all the nations are flocking to the Jews, even saying that they are Jews now. And this is an Old Testament kind of hope what's going to happen for the nations too, that they'll become and be brought into the Jewish people too. We are the Israel now in our day. So kind of a good Old Testament hope being kind of realized here a little bit. And maybe is where you get a lot of your God-fears too, this idea of the God-fears in the New Testament who, like the Jews, they practiced Jewish religion, but they themselves weren't Jews.
Yeah, because there was mention of some of those people.
Yeah, like Cornelius and things like that. And so you do see that. But kind of a cool, interesting line. And then we're told about the greatness of Mordecai, and he rises to the second level. You say kind of like a Joseph character, that he's kind of elevated to the second in command kind of rank. And then we're told that are these not written in the chronicles of the Medes and Persians, and all that stuff. So good. Anything else kind of stick out? Thoughts or anything?
I think I said everything I had thought of.
I think so too. As always, there's always more to say and to tell. We talk about the Apocrypha version of this and all that there, but it's a reminder of God's promise and his hope that he'll still do even following the exile. So good stuff.
That's kind of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther.
Right. Yeah, it's all kind of three of them tied together.
Yes.
Well, good. Well, let's close with a word of prayer then, and then we will give a blessing. So let us pray. Dear God, Heavenly Father, we give thanks for the fact that you have kept your promises, that you brought your people back home, and that you have given to them salvation through the form of your Son. And through what he has given that release now to us, who have been grafted into these people, who we are made into Israel. We have been made into your church. Lord, grant us peace and strength to follow you all of our days. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Amen.